Hello, Kentucky Realtors. Believe it or not, it's almost election day, and it seems a little strange because this isn't normally the time of year. But because of the pandemic, there's been a lot of changes. There's been changes in everything we do, it seems like, and the voting process is not an exception. So we had the opportunity to sit down and talk with the Secretary of State, Micahel Adams, about the changes so that we could be better prepared as we go to the polls. Richard Wilson, KYR's Government Affairs Director, and Paul Del Rio, our Communication Director, had the opportunity to interview him and ask about changes. And so we want you to hear their conversation and be prepared and also take part. We know that realtors are among the most active individuals when it comes to the electoral process. We also know that you're among the most registered group of all. And so please take part in this election. Help us elect realtor champions, and that's our responsibility so that we can help our industry and protect our industry. So listen to this conversation, and I'm sure you'll learn something.
Secretary, thank you so much for joining us today. Just to go ahead and jump right in. So you just finished your first legislative session as Secretary of State. Can you kind of just take us through your first session? How'd it go? Just kind of your first impressions as Secretary of State in your first session.
Well, thanks. Thanks for this opportunity. I had a good session. It seems like a million years ago right now in June, but we had a good session. The primary item I ran on in my campaign was requiring a photo ID to vote like other states do. I thought it was a good common sense measure. One of several I'm going to offer over my term, but a common sense measure to ensure integrity in our elections. And I was very pleased to see both houses pass this bill that I helped draft over the course of the session. I worked with stakeholders like the League of Women Voters and the ACLU to make the bill as humane and reasonable as I possibly could, make sure no one gets disenfranchised. I'm very proud that we provide free IDs to people who don't have one. I don't believe in poll taxes. We're actually going to improve people's lives by giving them a free benefit they wouldn't have had before. IDs are actually pretty expensive. So we're making them free to people who want to come get one. So I'm very pleased with that. That law will go into effect for the November election. It doesn't apply here in June. But I was very pleased to see that pass. I think I had one of the most successful sessions of any of our constitutional officers.
Well, that's great. Now, 2020 is a pretty big election year. Has your office seen an uptick in the number of newly registered voters in Kentucky? I know you probably have a spike as we approach a primary season, but have you noticed a trend one way or the other?
Well, interestingly, back in January, right after I took office, we had a surge. January, February, we had the highest registration we've ever had in our history. And then starting in March, it began to flatline. And in April, we actually purged more voters due to death or moving out of state or felony conviction. We actually removed more voters by law than we added new voters. We've had a flat line and actually now a decline in the size of our voter file for the simple reason that right now people can't do voter registration drives. All the civic groups that go out there and encourage people to register to vote, or for that matter, my office, we also do that ourselves. We travel the state holding voter registration drives. We can't do that. No one can do that right now. You can't travel and assemble with groups of people. And also, a lot of our county clerks and circuit clerks have been closed. They're not able to process driver's licenses, and that's how a lot of people get a voter registration form is automatically when they get a driver's license. And so without the sort of drive to get people to register, we've seen a flat line or a drop. We've been out there online encouraging people to register, but this is a rural state, and it's hard to reach a lot of people through social media and so forth. It's really a person-to-person sort of a thing, and we've not been able to have that.
Well, as a communications director, I have to maintain a database of about 12,000 folks, and keeping that clean and that information up to date is a challenge. I don't envy your position in keeping voter rolls functioning like they should. So we appreciate your efforts to do that.
My pleasure. It's important for the public to have confidence in our system. It's not just about photo ID. We also have to get our rolls cleaned up. A federal judge found us to be in violation a couple of years ago, but before I took office, I found that we had some counties that had more registrants than voting age citizens. found that we just hadn't lived up to our obligations under federal and state law. We haven't maintained our voter rolls accurately since 2009. We're way behind, and so there's about 8 to 10% of our voter file. That's max. It could be as little as 5, but there's a bare minimum of 5% of our voters that we believe are not legit voters. Fortunately, they don't usually vote, but there's still a vulnerability out there. If people know who's on the rolls, it's easy to falsify their identity. That's part of why we have a photo ID law now, and part of why we're getting our rolls cleaned up.
And I'm sure that also turnout counts and percentages as well. You need an accurate count of eligible voters. So
that's right. Actually, our turnout is better than we give ourselves credit for. When you've got a bunch of voters on the rolls who are dead or don't live here anymore, that makes our turnout look lower than it actually is, because we're still counting those people as registrants. So I actually think you'll see turnout go up once we get these rolls straightened out.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, for the Kentucky Realtors, I mean, we tout the number 89, and that 89 stands for 89% of the number of registered voters within our association. Of course, we would like to see that get into the 90s, 99, not about 95%, 93%, somewhere in there. We'd love to have that number. But get out the vote, and informing our members of changes in election is part of our core standard requirements with our national association. And obviously, the primary election has seen some changes this year. Can you kind of talk us through those changes? You know, how does someone vote in the primary this year? I know there's 4 steps someone can take in order to vote in the primary. Can you kind of just walk us through that and how y'all came to that determination?
Yeah, I'll tell you the 4 ways to vote, and I'll tell you the background on how the governor and I reached the agreement that we did on how this should look. So the short answer is there's 4 ways to vote. We didn't take anyone's rights away. The governor didn't want to take away rights from Democrats to vote in their primary. I would never do that to Republicans. In our primary, I'm a Republican. We protected the right to vote. We actually made it easier to vote than it normally is. And we also actually enhanced ballot security in a way we hadn't seen previously. We made absentee balloting even more secure than it normally is. So number 1, everyone can vote in person on election day. That's probably not the most convenient way to do it, either for yourself or for poll workers. We're going to have crowds at the polls because we have fewer locations available now and fewer poll workers available. But if that's what you want to do, if you need to vote in person, or if you insist on voting in person, that's your right under the Constitution. It's right there in our Constitution. The date's set, even the hours are set in our Constitution. So number 1, you can vote in person from 6 to 6 on election day. Number 2, you can vote in person early. Some of our clerks have actually already opened up early voting. Here in Frankfort, our clerk already has early voting available for in-person. Every county in the state, no later than this coming Monday, June 8th, will have early voting hours available during business hours. We do ask persons who want to vote early to make an appointment if they can. We won't turn voters away, but we do request people make appointments to do this, just because a lot of the venues we have for election day are large venues that can handle crowds and social distancing, but the clerk's offices are not designed for either of those. And that's where we're having most of our early voting. So we do ask people to call the clerk and make an appointment if they intend to vote in person early. The third way to vote is to vote absentee in person, which sounds like a contradiction, but what that means is you can go to govoteky.com, request your absentee ballot. You have to prove your identity by providing your name, address, date of birth, and social security number as it shows on your voter registration card. We've got all of those. We can verify that electronically. Once you do that, you're mailed a ballot. You can mark that at home while you're being healthy at home, and then you can bring it back to your clerk's office and hand deliver it. You don't have to, but you can if you choose, if you want to vote in person, but avoid the lines. If you want to have the personal satisfaction of delivering your ballot, dropping it in the bin, knowing it got there, then this is an option for you. We've bought drop boxes for all the county clerks for them to place in their offices under constant, continuous supervision, direct supervision, to make sure there's no cheating. But we do make 3 ways possible now for people to vote in person. The last way to vote is the way that's gotten the most attention, which is voting by mail. You can request your absentee ballot. We're not just going to mail ballots out to the phone book. You have to apply and prove your identity. But once you do that through govoteky.com or by calling your county clerk, we'll mail you a ballot. You fill it out at home and mail it back to us, and we pay for the postage. That's the most easy and convenient way to vote. It avoids crowds at the clerk's office and at the polling sites.
How does that compare to, I guess, what or some of our surrounding states and neighboring states, how does that compare to what they're doing?
Well, I will tell you, I've been a little taken aback by the criticism I've gotten on the right among Republicans for what we're doing. What we're doing is what other Republican secretaries of state are doing all across the country. The ideas that we have here are not hatched in a vacuum. They're ones that I borrowed from my Republican Secretary of State colleagues in Indiana and West Virginia and Iowa and Ohio and Nebraska and Idaho. We're doing what other states are doing. No state has had a regular in-person election instead of having absentee voting since early March, before COVID was a thing. Back on Super Tuesday, this wasn't perceived as a threat. Every state that's voted since early March, the last 3 months, has done what we're doing, or they're doing a more male-centric version of it. Ohio actually prohibited people from voting in person unless they were homeless or disabled. We didn't do that here. We're letting anyone vote in person who chooses to do that. We actually have a very conservative version of Election Day. It's not the version we usually have because we just can't keep people safe that way. The biggest criticism I've got, and it's certainly well-reasoned, is why are you all limiting the number of polling locations at a time we're trying to avoid crowds? That's backwards. The response to that is, this is not a feature, this is a bug. The bug is we don't have the locations. The nursing homes that normally serve as our polling locations, that's not safe. 3/5 of the fatalities from this disease in our state have been in nursing homes. The schools aren't available, the churches aren't available, they've canceled on us, or they've offered to serve, but they're not amenable to social distancing. They just can't handle it the way they're designed. So they're just not serviceable polling locations. It takes 3,600 polling locations to have a regular election. We didn't have a fraction of that many. Same with the poll workers. We didn't have enough PPE for all the sites. We're in competition with other states and now in competition with restaurants and retail here in Kentucky. They're reopening. And the poll workers canceled on us. We had 15,000 poll workers we needed to have a regular election. We've extended the deadline for poll workers 3 times. It just hasn't worked. People don't want to be poll workers right now, and you can't blame them. Most of our poll workers are senior citizens. They're the people that are most in jeopardy from this virus. So the only way to keep people safe, but also avoid long lines at the polls and people getting sick, is to encourage absentee voting, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, certainly a complex issue. These solutions that you've come up with, do you envision these sticking around for a while into the general election? And are you thinking about any other opportunities in different ways?
Well, the short answer is we don't know yet, because we're going to see how this goes and we're going to see how November shapes up. This was our best option, going about elections this way. We had no alternative. This is what we had to do under the law, but also under the facts. But we'll learn how well it works. We'll learn if we have any problems with the absentee balloting. We'll learn if we have any problems with the in-person balloting. And we'll see what works. And both the governor and I have said this. We're going to watch closely and assess and then make decisions for November. It's too soon to make them in early June. We're going to assess and then make decisions for the future. My hope is to have a regular election now that Kentucky's reopening. Our businesses are reopening, our restaurants, later this month, even our swimming pools, Kentucky Kingdom. My goal is to have a regular election under regular circumstances. But I will note this, we already have absentee balloting in Kentucky law. We didn't invent it for this election. We've had it actually for decades. It's in our state constitution. We actually have that in our state constitution next to in-person voting, which is also in our state constitution. For any person in November, even if the law doesn't change for November, any person who is of advanced age or ill, has a medical emergency, any person who feels the need to vote absentee on those bases or any other available basis is encouraged to do so.
Do you envision any difference in the way that election returns come in? I know when we watch the news and the polls close and then we kind of wait for results to trickle in, will all these different options will there be an active returns of returns all at once right when the polls close, or will there be a delay, or how do you envision the returns coming in?
It'll be a little of both, actually. So normally what you see is precinct election night reporting. We report how many precincts are outstanding, and that's how we come up with an estimate of how many votes are outstanding. People tend to wait and see a certain quantum of numbers in before they make projections about who won and who lost. We're not going to have that because we don't have the precincts open. Most of our voting is going to be done absentee. So here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is if people vote fairly early, if they get their absentee ballots back to us fairly early, those can be processed and tabulated before 6 p.m. on election night. That'll get us ahead of the curve in getting these ballots counted and enable us to offer results fairly quickly. Unlike Wisconsin, folks offer Wisconsin as an example of what to avoid. That's what I've tried to avoid, is what happened there. One of the things that they did that I disagreed with and we were doing differently is they actually prohibited any release of any numbers for a week. They said there's going to be no announcement of any results until a week after the election. We're not doing that. We're going to have election night results on election night, but some races will be called and others not. Depending on certain parts of the state and whether or not they got their absentee ballots in quickly or not, we may or may not have sufficient numbers for people to make projections. We are encouraging people to get their ballots back as soon as they can. That's going to mean it's not going to take as long to count them after the election, and we'll be able to offer more finality earlier. That's our hope.
Absolutely. So I've seen some of your recent interviews, and one of the questions that was asked kind of stuck out to me, and it centered around the cost of this election. Say your office, because I know one of the ideas was for your office to send out ballots to every single registered voter here in Kentucky. If that were to happen, any idea how much that would actually cost?
Yeah, it costs roughly $1 to send a ballot and roughly $1 to have it sent back, as we're paying for the postage. There's 3.4 million people on our voter file, so you're looking at $7.8 million. It's pretty expensive. And that doesn't even count the cost of having in-person voting, which again is in our Constitution. It's required. I don't believe I have the authority by law to eliminate in-person voting, even if I wanted to. So the election would be very, very expensive if we did that. I won't do that unless I'm ordered to by a judge, and I don't expect that'll happen. And here's another reason. It's not just the cost. It's also the fact that it would be, from my perspective, a corruption nightmare to just mail ballots out to the voter file. As I said, a significant portion of our voters are people who are dead or don't live in this state anymore. We're in the process of getting those people removed, but it takes time. It takes court permission. It takes resources. I'm just not comfortable, and I don't think the public would be comfortable with just mailing ballots out to every mailbox. I think a better method is what we're actually doing, which is what I got the governor to agree to. We're requiring people to prove their identity by applying for an application, by applying for an absentee ballot before they get a ballot mailed to them. That's a way we ensure that you just don't have boxes out there, mailboxes with ballots in them for people who don't live there anymore.
Right. Absolutely. So two-part question here. This will be my final question, and then Paul will close for us. So two-part question here. I know you and Attorney General Daniel Cameron helped form the Ballot Integrity Task Force. Can you kind of go into some detail for us and kind of tell us a little bit about that? And then second, can voters feel confident in the process that is currently in place for the primary election?
Sure. I'll answer the second one first. The answer is absolutely. Not to tout my own, toot my own horn, but I'm the only election specialist who's ever served as the chief election official. I have a long career in election law. I've served on the State Board of Elections, and I'm a specialist in this field. And I'm partnering with Attorney General Cameron and his team of prosecutors. We know what to watch for. We know what cheating looks like. We also know what voter confusion looks like. I think that vote fraud is always a real threat. I don't dismiss it. But voter confusion is also a threat. I think it's a bigger threat in this election than vote fraud is. So that's why it's so good that you all are doing this and helping me get this message out about how this process will work. So this task force, Attorney General Cameron and I are co-chairing this. We've got federal prosecutors. We've got the Kentucky State Police. We've got the Postal Service. We've got the Department of Homeland Security. We've got the FBI. We're all partnered together, and we confer regularly by phone and email and meetings, discussing ways to ensure that we have a safe and secure election. I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that we're monitoring. So number one, election fraud is real. I won't dismiss it. I talked about it in my campaign. I still believe it's real, but it's not a mass conspiracy. People don't steal national elections or statewide elections with vote fraud. It's just not feasible, at least not in Kentucky. But people have been caught stealing elections for local office. They tend to cheat when they cheat in local elections for mayor, for county judge executive, because it's about patronage. It's about getting control in a small county of the local office and the resources there. And that's where you tend to see conspiracies. All 22 people who have gone to prison in the last decade and a half for election fraud in Kentucky that I found, it was all local races. So that's what we're monitoring, especially our task force. We're watching jurisdictions around the state that are having local elections on the ballot in June, not just for president and U.S. Senate and U.S. Congress and so forth. Number two, here's the kind of stuff we're actually looking at on the ground. We're watching addresses that request multiple ballots. You can't just punch in your address and get a ballot. You got to have other verifying information, but we've got addresses that request 40 or 60 ballots. We run all those down to see what's going on. So for example, we had an address in Marion County a couple of weeks ago that asked for 41 ballots. We thought that was suspicious, so we ran it down. It's a nursing home. Well, you want that. You want people in a nursing home who need to be kept there and kept safe from venturing out and voting in person. We want them to vote absentee. So that checked out just fine. But we're monitoring addresses that request multiple ballots. We're also monitoring people on the voter file who are on the inactive list, people who've been scheduled to be removed as voters because they're not legitimate voters anymore. We're watching to see if they apply for ballots, because that would be quite unusual if they do. So we do monitor this in real time. We're working with the State Board of Elections and the county clerks and people across the state to make sure that we have integrity in this election.
Very good. We personally feel that voting in elections and being involved in our political process is important, but I know a lot of people might feel like their vote doesn't matter, especially if they're disenfranchised or if their personal opinions don't bear out in the polls. So does an individual's vote matter as people consider whether to get out here in the primary?
Well, it certainly does, and I'll give you some examples. Just down the hall from me is a governor who won by 5,138 votes statewide. That's about a third of a percentage point. That's really close. That's about a vote or a vote and a half per precinct. It's a very close election, and it decides a lot of policy. In the legislative races in 2018, the last election cycle, I believe we had 7 races decided by 35 votes or fewer. We had, I think it was 4 races decided by 7 votes or fewer. Pretty amazing. We had one that was a tied race for the legislature. We had another one that was 5 votes, one that was 7 votes. These votes matter. You can really impact the direction of our state, even with just one or a handful of votes. It makes a big difference.
Secretary, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today to talk about this very important election and the new process that you all have set in place for us to follow. And again, thank you so much. And we look forward to speaking with you in the future, and who knows, maybe again for the general election. So thank you so much.
I'd love to come back. Thanks for your courtesy. And just a quick reminder, go vote Kentucky. The deadline to request your absentee ballot is Monday, June 15th. Then we have to close it down because there's not time to get more ballots out after that. So please go to govoteky.com by June 15th and make sure your vote counts.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.